The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and broken dreams. I sat in the corner, watching my cousins circle like vultures around Grandpa's estate. At 45, I'd learned to stay quiet during family gatherings, especially when money was involved. But this was different. This was Grandpa's final goodbye. "To my grandson Jake," the lawyer read, adjusting his glasses, "I leave my 1952 John Deere Model B tractor, currently stored in the back barn." The room erupted in snickers. My cousin Derek actually laughed out loud. "That piece of junk hasn't run in 20 years, he whispered to his sister Sarah. While they divided up the farmhouse, the 60 acres of prime land, and Grandpa's substantial savings account, I got the tractor that everyone considered worthless scrap metal. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one who'd spent every summer working alongside Grandpa, learning to fix engines and tend crops. I was the one who'd listened to his stories about the old days, yet here I was, walking away with what appeared to be the consolation prize. But I knew something they didn't. Grandpa never did anything without purpose. Every decision he made had layers, like the rings of an old oak tree. As I signed the paperwork for my inheritance, I caught the lawyer's eye. He gave me the slightest nod, almost imperceptible. There was something more to this story, and I intended to find out what it was. The others were already making plans to sell their portions. I was making plans to restore mine. 3 days later, I drove my pickup down the familiar dirt road to Grandpa's farm. The new owners, my cousins, had already started clearing out the main house, but they'd given me permission to haul away that old junk tractor whenever I wanted. They were eager to see it gone. The back barn stood exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits. Weathered wood, rusted hinges, and that distinctive smell of old hay and motor oil. I pulled open the heavy doors, and there she sat. The 1952 John Deere Model B, covered in dust and bird droppings, looking every bit as forgotten as my cousins believed her to be. But I saw something different. Beneath the grime and neglect, I could see the bones of a well-built machine. The tires were flat but not cracked beyond repair. The paint was faded but not rusted through. Most importantly, the engine block looked solid. Grandpa had always maintained his equipment, even when he'd stopped using it regularly. I spent an hour just walking around the tractor, running my hands along the metal, checking connections and looking for obvious problems. The fuel tank was empty, the oil was black as tar, and the battery was long dead. But these were fixable problems. What struck me most was how carefully the tractor had been positioned in the barn. It wasn't just abandoned here. It had been deliberately placed and protected. As I prepared to load it onto my trailer, I noticed something odd. The barn floor around the tractor was cleaner than it should have been, as if someone had been maintaining this space long after the machine stopped running. Back at my workshop, I began the slow process of bringing the old John Deere back to life. This wasn't just about fixing a tractor. It was about connecting with Grandpa's memory and understanding why he'd chosen to leave me this particular inheritance. I started with the basics, draining the old fluids, cleaning decades of grime from the engine, and assessing what needed replacement versus what could be restored. The more I worked, the more I realized this tractor had been better maintained than it appeared. Someone had been taking care of it, even recently. The carburetor, while dirty, showed signs of recent attention. The spark plugs were old, but not the original ones from 1952. Most telling was the oil filter. It was a modern replacement, installed maybe 5 years ago. Grandpa had been quietly maintaining this machine long after everyone assumed it was dead. As I worked late into the evening, I found myself talking to the tractor the way Grandpa used to talk to his equipment. "Come on, old girl," I'd say while wrestling with a stubborn bolt. "Tell me your secrets." It felt natural, like continuing a conversation that had been interrupted but never really ended. My wife brought me coffee around 10 o'clock. "You know," she said, watching me work, "your grandfather called last month asking if you still had your welding equipment." I looked up from the engine compartment. "He did," she nodded. "Said he might have a project for you soon." The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Grandpa had been planning something. 3 weeks into the restoration, I made my first real discovery. While cleaning the seat assembly, I noticed that the padding felt unusually thick and lumpy. When I removed the worn vinyl covering, I found something wrapped in oilcloth hidden inside the foam, a hand-drawn map of the farm property with several locations marked with X's. The map was in Grandpa's handwriting, showing not just the current buildings but also structures that no longer existed. An old root cellar, a demolished chicken coop, and what appeared to be a well that had been filled in decades ago. But most intriguing were the X marks scattered across the property, each with a date and a cryptic notation. I spread the map on my workbench and compared it to my memories of the farm. Some of the marked locations I recognized: the big oak tree by the creek, the corner of the north pasture where the fence posts were different from the others. But others were mysteries, places I'd never paid attention to during my childhood visits. That evening, I called my Uncle Pete, Grandpa's youngest brother, and the only family member who might know about these markings. "Oh, that old treasure map," he chuckled when I described what I'd found. "Your grandpa was always burying things and making maps. Started during the Depression when banks weren't trustworthy. Probably just old fruit jars with a few dollars in them." But Uncle Pete's dismissive tone didn't match the careful way Grandpa had hidden this map. This wasn't the work of someone playing games. This was deliberate, purposeful, and meant for me to find. The question was, what exactly was I supposed to be looking for? The breakthrough came while I was rebuilding the hydraulic system. I needed to access the main hydraulic reservoir, which meant removing several panels from the tractor's body. As I worked my way around the machine, I noticed that one panel didn't quite fit the way it should. The bolt pattern was slightly different, and the metal showed signs of being removed and replaced multiple times. When I finally got the panel off, I found myself staring at a space that shouldn't have existed. Behind the false panel was a compartment about the size of a shoebox, lined with rubber gaskets to keep it waterproof, and it wasn't empty. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and oilcloth, were documents, bank statements, property deeds, and correspondence dating back to the 1960s. But most shocking was a letter addressed to me personally, written in Grandpa's careful handwriting and dated just 6 months before his death. "Jake," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you were smart enough to really restore this old tractor instead of just hauling it to the scrapyard. I always knew you had more sense than the rest of them." The letter went on to explain that the documents in the compartment were copies of everything related to what he called the real inheritance. According to Grandpa's letter, the farm property contained something far more valuable than anyone realized. The original land grant from 1889 included mineral rights that had never been sold or transferred. Recent geological surveys had confirmed significant natural gas deposits beneath the property. The cousins who'd inherited the land had no idea they were sitting on a fortune, but there was more. The letter included detailed instructions for accessing additional hidden caches around the property, each containing more pieces of the puzzle. Armed with Grandpa's map and letter, I began exploring the farm property under the cover of visiting the old place for sentimental reasons. My cousins were busy with their own lives and paid little attention to my nostalgic wanderings. The first location marked on the map was the old oak tree by the creek. Grandpa's instructions were specific. 15 paces north from the lightning scar, look for the stone that doesn't belong. It took me an hour of searching, but I finally found it. A piece of limestone among granite field stones, clearly placed rather than naturally occurring. Beneath the stone was a metal box, wrapped in plastic and buried about 2 feet down. Inside were more documents, correspondence with geological survey companies, mineral rights lawyers, and energy companies that had been quietly investigating the area. Grandpa had been playing a long game, gathering information while keeping his discoveries secret. The second cache, hidden in the foundation of the old demolished chicken coop, contained financial records showing that Grandpa had been approached multiple times by energy companies wanting to lease the mineral rights. He'd turned them all down, waiting for the right moment. According to his notes, he'd been planning to reveal everything after ensuring the family would be protected from their own greed and inexperience. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of Grandpa's strategy. He'd known that a sudden windfall would tear the family apart. He'd seen what happened to other farming families when oil or gas money entered the picture. His solution was to ensure that the person who inherited the real treasure would be someone who understood the value of patience and hard work. As I pieced together Grandpa's hidden legacy, I realized I faced a complex legal situation. The mineral rights belonged to whoever owned the surface land, my cousins. But Grandpa's documents revealed that he'd been negotiating a deal that would benefit everyone if handled correctly. I spent a sleepless night reading through contracts and correspondence. Grandpa had been in talks with a major energy company about a development deal worth millions, but he'd structured the negotiations to require unanimous family consent, knowing that would force everyone to work together rather than fighting over individual shares. The problem was that my cousins had no idea any of this existed. They were already making plans to subdivide and sell the property to developers who wanted to build a shopping center. If they went through with those plans, the mineral rights would be lost forever, sold for a fraction of their true value. I had a choice to make. I could keep Grandpa's secret and let events unfold naturally, or I could reveal what I'd discovered and risk the family chaos that Grandpa had tried to avoid. But there was a third option, one that Grandpa had hinted at in his final letter. The tractor was never the real inheritance, he'd written. It was the key to understanding what the real inheritance means. Use your judgment, Jake. You're the only one I trust to do the right thing. The weight of that trust was overwhelming. Grandpa had spent years setting up a situation that could make the entire family wealthy, but only if someone with wisdom and integrity guided the process. I called a family meeting for the following Saturday, telling my cousins I had something important to discuss about Grandpa's estate. They agreed reluctantly, probably expecting me to ask for a loan or complain about my inheritance. The meeting took place in Derek's living room, with all the major beneficiaries present: Derek, Sarah, their younger brother Mike, and our cousin Lisa. I'd brought a box of documents but kept the most sensitive materials hidden. I needed to gauge their reactions before revealing everything. "I've been going through some of Grandpa's old papers," I began carefully, "and I think there might be some complications with the property sale you're planning." Derek rolled his eyes. "What kind of complications? The lawyers already cleared the title." I pulled out one of the geological surveys, a relatively innocuous document that mentioned potential subsurface resources without specifying their value. "Did you know that Grandpa had the property surveyed for mineral rights?" The room went quiet. Sarah leaned forward to examine the document. "What does this mean exactly?" Lisa asked. She was the most level-headed of the group, a nurse who understood the importance of details. I explained the basics of mineral rights and how they could affect property values. "I think we should have our own survey done before we make any final decisions about selling." The reaction was mixed. Derek was skeptical, convinced this was just another delay tactic. Mike seemed interested, but overwhelmed. Sarah and Lisa wanted to know more. It was exactly the response I'd hoped for. Enough curiosity to justify further investigation, but not enough panic to cause immediate chaos. 2 weeks later, after the family had time to process the initial information, I called another meeting. This time, I brought everything: the hidden documents, Grandpa's letters, and a full explanation of what I'd discovered. The room was silent as I laid out the evidence. Bank statements showing Grandpa's negotiations with energy companies, geological reports confirming significant natural gas deposits, legal documents outlining a development deal worth an estimated $12 million. $12 million? Derek's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah was staring at the documents as if they might disappear. Mike had gone pale. Lisa was the first to speak coherently. Why didn't he tell us? Why hide all this? I read them Grandpa's letter explaining his reasoning, how he'd seen other families destroyed by sudden wealth, how he'd wanted to ensure that any development would be done responsibly, with proper legal protection and fair distribution, how he'd chosen me as the executor of his real plan because he trusted me to put family unity above personal gain. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. I explained that the energy company was still interested in the deal, but it required unanimous family consent. We could move forward together, following Grandpa's carefully laid plans, or we could abandon the opportunity and proceed with the original property sale. The discussion that followed was intense, but surprisingly civil. For the first time in years, the family was working together toward a common goal. Grandpa's strategy was working exactly as he'd intended: Over the next month, we worked together to understand and evaluate Grandpa's deal with Meridian Energy Corporation. The terms were more favorable than any of us had imagined. Instead of a simple lease agreement, Grandpa had negotiated a partnership that would give the family ongoing royalties plus a substantial upfront payment. I took the lead in the negotiations, partly because I'd inherited Grandpa's research and partly because the others recognized that I understood his intentions better than anyone. But every major decision was made as a group, with full transparency and unanimous consent. The energy company was impressed by our unity and preparation. "Your grandfather was a remarkable negotiator," the lead representative told us. "He anticipated every possible complication and built protections into the deal that benefit everyone involved." It was clear that Grandpa's reputation for integrity had paved the way for our success. The final agreement included environmental protections for the property, guaranteed employment for local workers, and a development timeline that would minimize disruption to the surrounding community. Grandpa had thought of everything, even details that wouldn't affect the family directly, but would ensure the project benefited the entire area. As we signed the contracts, I felt Grandpa's presence in the room. This was exactly what he'd envisioned. The family working together, making decisions based on wisdom rather than greed, and creating a legacy that would benefit future generations. The upfront payment alone was enough to secure everyone's financial future. The ongoing royalties would provide income for decades to come. With the energy deal finalized, I returned to completing the restoration of the John Deere. It had served its purpose as a treasure map and document vault, but I wanted to honor Grandpa's memory by getting it running again. As I installed the final components, I discovered one last surprise. Hidden in the air filter housing was a small envelope containing a single photograph and a brief note. The photograph showed Grandpa as a young man, standing next to the same tractor when it was brand new. He couldn't have been more than 25, with the confident smile of someone who believed in the future. The note was simple. "This tractor fed my family for 40 years. Now it's fed yours for generations to come. Take care of her, Jake. She's earned her rest." Below that, in smaller writing, "P.S. Check the oil every 50 hours and she'll outlive us all." I laughed despite the tears in my eyes. Even in his final message, Grandpa was giving practical advice. It was so perfectly him, sentimental and pragmatic in equal measure. The tractor started on the third try, the engine settling into a steady rhythm that sounded like contentment. I drove it around my property for an hour, thinking about everything that had happened. The old John Deere had been far more than an inheritance. It had been a teacher, a treasure chest, and a bridge between generations. That evening, I called each of my cousins to let them know the tractor was running. "Grandpa would be proud," Sarah said, and for once, there was no sarcasm in her voice. The months that followed brought changes none of us had expected. The financial security from the energy deal allowed everyone to pursue dreams that had been postponed by practical concerns. Derek started the custom farming business he'd always wanted. Sarah went back to school to become a veterinarian. Mike bought a small ranch and began raising horses. Lisa expanded her nursing practice to include home health care for rural communities. But more important than the money was the restoration of family relationships that had been strained for years. We began having regular family dinners again, sharing stories and making plans together. The cousins' children, who barely knew each other before, became close friends. I kept the tractor at my place but made it available for family gatherings and local events. It became a symbol of what we'd accomplished together, something old and forgotten that had been restored to usefulness through patience and care. The energy development proceeded smoothly, with minimal environmental impact and maximum community benefit. Grandpa's insistence on responsible development had created a model that other communities began to study and emulate. 1 year after the will reading, we held a memorial service for Grandpa at the farm. The entire extended family attended, along with neighbors and friends who had known him for decades. We shared stories about his wisdom, his humor, and his uncanny ability to see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. As the service ended, I started up the old John Deere and gave rides to anyone who wanted one. Children laughed as they bounced along on the vintage machine, and adults smiled at memories of their own childhood adventures on similar tractors. Looking back on everything that happened, I understand now that Grandpa's real gift wasn't the money, or the property, or even the tractor. It was the lesson about patience, planning, and the importance of family unity. He could have revealed his discoveries at any time, but he waited until he could ensure they would bring the family together, rather than tear it apart. The restored John Deere sits in my barn now, maintained and ready to work whenever needed. I've taught my own children how to operate it, passing on not just mechanical skills, but the stories that give those skills meaning. They understand that the tractor represents more than just a piece of farm equipment. It's a link to their heritage, and a reminder that the most valuable inheritances aren't always the most obvious ones. I still follow Grandpa's maintenance schedule religiously, checking the oil every 50 hours and keeping detailed records of every repair and adjustment. The tractor runs better now than it probably did when it was new, a testament to what can be accomplished when someone cares enough to do things right. Sometimes, when I'm working on other projects in the shop, I catch myself talking to the old John Deere the way Grandpa used to talk to his equipment. It's become a habit, a way of staying connected to his memory and his wisdom. And sometimes I swear I can hear him talking back, offering advice, or just sharing the comfortable silence of two people who understand the satisfaction of honest work. The family business we created from Grandpa's legacy continues to grow and prosper. We've expanded into renewable energy projects and sustainable agriculture, always guided by his principles of responsibility and community benefit. The next generation is already showing interest in continuing the tradition, asking questions and learning skills that will serve them well in whatever future they choose to create. Thank you for listening to this story about family, inheritance, and the wisdom of patience. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and whether you have any similar family stories to share. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories about the unexpected treasures hidden in ordinary lives. Sometimes the best inheritances come disguised as the things nobody else wants.